Preserving the wildness of a place has not always been our thing as a species. To this day, many still see wilderness as a place to be conquered, or at least tamed. If we don't convert it to our use by the plow or the oil rig, we at least want to make enjoying its beauty something that requires little effort on our part. The concept of preserving the wild for its own purpose is new to the human race, and could be said is a colonial European concept. Native cultures in the Americas did not really see man as separate from nature. Man and earth functioned in tandem, and yet native tribes also bent ecosystems to serve a human purpose by engaging in activities like intentional burning of the forest long before Europeans arrived on this continent. Native Americans saw no line between themselves and the natural world, but Europeans arrived here with a mindset of wildness as something to be feared, conquered, and made pastoral. European culture around nature was framed much like the walled-off city you might find in the Old World. Humankind was safe within those walls, but beyond was all manner of beasts and wild things. That way of thinking made it to the North American continent with the Puritans. The entire continent was seen as one wild place to be conquered, to be made pastoral. It was the wildness of the New World that would survive long enough to see nature become what defined this new country. You see, following the Revolution and through the early 1800s, the United States was trying to figure out what defined itself, what made it unique from where we came. See, Europe had centuries of arts and architecture, of composers, cathedrals, and capitals. What did it mean to be an American? It was the Romantics of the 1820s that would paint upon the American ethos that these wild places are what defined us as a nation. Painters and poets, sculptors and writers experienced the wonders of primitive landscapes largely unaltered by man, and began to paint upon the American ethos this idea of natural cathedrals that the North American continent had in spades. Each passing decade saw small steps towards protecting, or the setting aside from development, the remaining wildness of our growing country, and each of those time periods had wilderness champions that not only kept the fire burning, but passed the torch to the next generation, the wilderness firekeepers, if you will. These firekeepers came from all walks of life, and each of them pursued in their own way how the story of wilderness should and will remain an American story. There were artists like Bierstadt and writers like Thoreau, passionate advocates like John Muir, and powerful politicians like Teddy Roosevelt. These early firekeepers helped give rise to the national park idea, to holding on to other public commons like our national forest and wildlife refuge system, and they helped fend off much of the rush to commercialize and modify our vast holdings as a nation. The idea of preserving wilderness evolved and continues to evolve because it had to. You see, by the early 1900s, a rapidly growing population, an increase in mechanization, and deeper understandings of natural systems and natural processes were bringing to light that it was going to take more than our fledgling public land system to preserve the wildness of a place. This brought forward a new generation of firekeepers, ones that realized it was going to take legislative action to preserve this enduring resource of wilderness forever. These new firekeepers would include famous names like Aldo Leopold and little-known bureaucrats like Howard Zonheiser. Carrying the flame forward would require a broader connection to the idea of wilderness among the American public. It would require a set of professionals to not only communicate wilderness values in new ways, but it would require instilling those values in new communities. Throughout my wilderness experience, I've been influenced by a number of keepers of the wilderness flame, but two have had a profound impact on my life and on my thinking. Two New Yorkers named Bob and JJ. Bob and JJ have a lot in common. They both had experiences spent in wild places as young men have a profound impact on their life. They also both realized that public lands and wild places needed to be equitable and accessible to the entire American public. And they both expressed a personal euphoria from time spent in wild places. That's where the similarities end. You see, Bob was born into wealth, the son of a prominent attorney, and JJ, the son of Puerto Rican immigrants. Bob spent his youth in the Adirondacks at their family camp, while JJ spent his youth in and out of foster care and even spent 4 years homeless. From his father, Bob learned to look out for the less fortunate, a part of his Jewish faith, while JJ learned from his father the perseverance and hunger that had feed you to overcome obstacles in your life. Bob spent his 10 years bagging peaks in his beloved Adirondacks while JJ was catching up on an education that had been hard to come by in his early years. But eventually, JJ would find himself in the woods as well, in the lush green forests of the southern Appalachians. While Bob would find his way to the New York School of Forestry at Syracuse University and eventually secure a PhD from Johns Hopkins, JJ would not only catch up with his classwork, but he would flourish and be accepted to the United States Naval Academy. As Bob's time hiking in the mountains led to a career mostly of public lands, JJ would of course take his talents to military service, having to find his own way to be a force for wilderness. Before settling at the United States Naval Academy, JJ spent a summer on a wilderness trail crew for Southern Appalachian Wilderness Stewards. That's where our paths would first cross. Time spent in magical places like the Linville Gorge and Joyce Kilmer Slick Rock Wildernesses really had a big impact on JJ. Prior to his time in the southern woods, he'd had limited opportunities to be in and around big wild places. But once he found it, he owned it. But he also realized that there were barriers to those experiences for others like him. And he realized that he wanted to do something about those barriers. And that's something he would have in common with Bob. See, Bob, in his time with the United States Forest Service, was in charge of some very important policies related to recreation. He saw our public lands as the ultimate manifestation of democracy, something that should be the public commons, accessible to all of us. In those policies, he tried to root out systemic racism. He tried to create opportunities for those who live in urban metropolitan centers to have access to their public lands by providing transportation. Actually, some of Bob's policies led to JJ having the experiences he had in the southern Appalachian woods later. JJ, realizing the profound scope of his wilderness experience, would, in 2016, start a wilderness stewardship program at the Naval Academy that will connect generations of future leaders to time spent in wild places, keeping the wilderness flame alive. Bob, besides proposing groundbreaking policies that would make public lands accessible to all of us, also almost single-handedly willed into existence the organization that would raise public awareness around wilderness and drive wilderness legislation to the passage of the Wilderness Act in 1964. You see, Bob was Bob Marshall, founder of the Wilderness Society and primary funder of the society in its early years. Bob wrote early wilderness regulations that continue to influence what is now a system of 111 million acres of national treasure, and would be firekeeper for wild places through the 1920s and 30s until his untimely death in 1939 at 38 years of age. The flame comes full circle, you see. The Wilderness Society that Bob was so critical in getting off the ground was the same organization that grew and supported Southern Appalachian Wilderness Stewards, a program that provided JJ his first taste of wilderness and lit a fire that continues through Naval Academy midshipmen to this day. In 2014, when the country was celebrating 50 years of the Wilderness Act, JJ's story was featured on the walls of the Museum of Natural History at the Smithsonian. How a young man grabbed his opportunity, combined it with his new passion for wilderness, and continued keeping the wilderness flame burning into the 21st century, just as Bob had done in the early years of the century before. Born nearly 100 years apart, these two continue to have a major impact today. Bob Marshall's impact is felt in the state of Montana with the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, named in his honor. It's big, like 1.5 million acres big. And I have the good fortune of leading the Bob Marshall Wilderness Foundation, which provides a connection to the wilderness heritage we all have as Americans through volunteer service in the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex. JJ continues to be an inspiration to many and always finds a way to use his experience to give others a chance at transformation that only wilderness can provide. His service in uniform continues as an officer in the United States Marine Corps, providing leadership in ways that only he can. His influence on my life is profound. He has become a rock within our family, an example to others, and someone my wife and I are proud to call our son, not by birth, but by providence. JJ and Bob, yes, are two of my favorite keepers of the wilderness flame, but they're only two, separated by a century in their service to the wilderness idea. There were lots that came before, between, and there will be lots that come after. We will need more. We always need more. Wilderness ebbs and flows as society reaches and lurches forward. Sometimes it feels like we've reached that horizon that might extinguish the wilderness flame. But then there's the firekeepers, maybe someone like you. See, wilderness, blank spots on the map. Without that, it would be a pretty hollow existence. And we don't want to ever leave that for those that come after. Can you be a firekeeper?